Welcome. You're here now, and there's nothing else you need to do. Allow your thoughts to drift slowly back through time, settling softly into an era illuminated by candlelight and the glow of a young nation's dreams. Tonight, you'll journey quietly beside a figure whose steady hand guided history, a man whose measured resolve reshaped a nation, whose quiet strength carried him through harsh winters, fierce battles, and the birth of a lasting legacy. His story is not merely one of triumph in warfare or leadership in government, but of private courage under starlit skies at Mount Vernon, of thoughtful reflection beside flickering fires, and of integrity tested and proven on distant battlefields and in halls of power. This is the life of George Washington, the leader, the visionary, the enduring voice behind America's founding. Close your eyes. Allow today to gently fade and listen as an extraordinary tale unfolds. George Washington was born on February 22nd, 1732, at Pope's Creek, nestled within Virginia's Westmoreland County. The eldest of 6 children born to Augustine Washington and Mary Ball Washington, George entered a family already shaped by complexity. Augustine was a prominent local figure who served as a justice of the peace and brought with him 4 children from a previous marriage to Jane Butler. George's relationship with his father was distant, rarely discussed or reflected upon in later life, and his interactions with his mother were often strained. Among his siblings, however, George found a close bond with his elder half-brother, Lawrence. In 1735, the Washington family relocated to a plantation situated on Little Hunting Creek before finally settling in 1738 at Ferry Farm near Fredericksburg. Tragedy struck in 1743 when Augustine passed away, leaving young George the owner of Ferry Farm and inheritor of 10 enslaved people. Lawrence, meanwhile, inherited the Little Hunting Creek estate, which he soon renamed Mount Vernon. Due to his father's untimely death, George missed out on the formal education his older half-brothers had enjoyed at England's Appleby Grammar School. Instead, he attended the local lower church school in Hartfield, where he cultivated a keen aptitude for mathematics and land surveying, skills that led him to become a remarkably skilled draftsman and mapmaker. By his early adulthood, George's writing had developed a powerful clarity and meticulousness, qualities later praised by his biographer Ron Chernow. During his teenage years, George diligently recorded over 100 social rules into a personal guide titled The Rules of Civility, adapted from an English translation of a French etiquette manual. These guidelines underscored his lifelong dedication to precision, self-discipline, and dignified interpersonal conduct. Washington frequently spent time at Belvoir, the plantation owned by William Fairfax, the father-in-law of his beloved half-brother Lawrence. Fairfax became an influential figure in young Washington's life, serving as both a mentor and father figure. In 1748, Washington joined a surveying expedition for Fairfax, helping map out the extensive Shenandoah Valley properties. The following year, despite not having undergone the traditional apprenticeship, Washington secured a surveyor's license from the College of William and Mary, and shortly after was appointed surveyor for Culpeper County by Thomas Fairfax, William's cousin. He officially began this role on July 20th, 1749, though he resigned the following year. By 1752, Washington had expanded his landholdings substantially, owning approximately 2,315 acres, including around 1,500 acres in the fertile Shenandoah Valley. In 1751, Washington traveled outside mainland North America for the first and only time in his life, journeying with Lawrence to Barbados in hopes of curing his brother's worsening tuberculosis. During this trip, Washington contracted smallpox, which left minor scars on his face. Sadly, Lawrence succumbed to his illness in 1752, after which George leased Mount Vernon from Lawrence's widow, Anne. He eventually inherited the estate fully upon her death in 1761. Inspired by Lawrence's previous service as Adjutant General of the Virginia Militia, Washington pursued a military commission. He was appointed Major and District Commander by Virginia's Lieutenant Governor, Robert Dinwiddie, amid rising tensions between British and French interests over the strategic Ohio River Valley. The British built forts along the riverbanks, while the French fortified positions between the river and Lake Erie. In October 1753, Dinwiddie selected Washington as a special envoy tasked with delivering an ultimatum to the French: vacate the contested territories claimed by Britain. Washington was also instructed to establish diplomatic relations with the Iroquois Confederacy and gather intelligence on French forces. At Logstown, Washington met the Iroquois leader Tanacharison, who reportedly bestowed upon him the name Conotochorius, meaning devourer of villages. Interestingly, this same title had been given decades earlier to his great-grandfather John Washington by the Susquehannock people. In November 1753, Washington's expedition reached the Ohio River, where they encountered a French patrol. The French escorted them politely to Fort Le Boeuf, where Washington delivered the British demand to Jacques Le Gardeur de Saint-Pierre, the French commander. Despite the courteous reception, the French firmly declined to vacate their position. After several days, Saint-Pierre provided Washington with an official response, along with provisions and winter clothing, for the challenging journey back to Virginia. Washington successfully navigated harsh winter conditions to complete this delicate mission, earning respect when his detailed report was subsequently published in both Virginia and London. In February 1754, Governor Dinwiddie elevated Washington to the rank of lieutenant colonel, appointing him second in command of the Virginia Regiment, comprising 300 troops. Washington's orders were clear: confront the French at the strategically vital forks of the Ohio. Departing in April with half of his regiment, Washington soon discovered that approximately 1,000 French soldiers had started building Fort Duquesne at the target location. Establishing a defensive stance at Great Meadows in May, Washington learned of a smaller French encampment just 7 miles away. Seizing the initiative, he launched a surprise attack on May 28th. Washington's modest force, supported by Native American allies, defeated the small French detachment, killing its commander Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, who carried diplomatic papers meant for the British. The aftermath proved controversial. French forces accused Washington of unjustly killing their envoy and retreated to Fort Necessity. When the remainder of the Virginia Regiment arrived in June, bringing news of Washington's promotion to colonel and full command, additional complications arose. An independent company of South Carolinian troops led by Captain James Mackay joined, and his royal commission superseded Washington's authority, creating command tensions. On July 3rd, a sizable force of about 900 French troops attacked Fort Necessity, forcing Washington's eventual surrender. Unfamiliar with French, Washington unknowingly signed a document claiming responsibility for Jumonville's assassination, a mistake he later attributed to inaccurate translation. Following this, British authorities reorganized the Virginia Regiment and offered Washington a captaincy, effectively a demotion, since colonials were barred from holding ranks higher than captain. Insulted, he chose instead to resign his commission. The controversial Jumonville affair escalated tensions significantly, effectively igniting the French and Indian War. In 1755, Washington volunteered as aide-de-camp to General Edward Braddock, who was tasked with expelling the French from Fort Duquesne and the Ohio Territory. Based on Washington's advice, Braddock split his forces into a main army and a smaller, more mobile contingent. Suffering from severe dysentery, Washington initially remained behind, but joined Braddock at the Monongahela River while still gravely ill. Shortly after, the French and their Native American allies ambushed the divided British force. In the chaos of the Battle of Monongahela, 2/3 of the British troops fell, including General Braddock. Despite the dire circumstances, Washington displayed exceptional leadership, rallying survivors under Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Gage and forming a protective rear guard that allowed a safe retreat. During the intense combat, Washington had 2 horses shot beneath him, and bullets tore through his hat and coat. His courageous actions at Monongahela restored much of the reputation tarnished by Fort Necessity's surrender. Nonetheless, the subsequent British commander, Colonel Thomas Dunbar, excluded Washington from further operational planning. In August 1755, the Virginia Regiment was reorganized, and Governor Dinwiddie once again appointed George Washington as its commander, reinstating him as a colonel. Almost immediately, Washington faced a dispute over seniority with Captain John Dagworthy, who commanded a contingent of Maryland troops stationed at Fort Cumberland, the regiment's headquarters. Washington, eager for decisive military action against Fort Duquesne, strongly believed that General Braddock would have granted him a royal commission had he survived. Determined, he advocated his case first to William Shirley, Braddock's successor, in February 1756, and then again to Shirley's successor, Lord Loudon, in January 1757. Loudon not only denied Washington's request for a royal commission, but also openly humiliated him, conceding only to relieve him of his command at Fort Cumberland. In 1758, Washington's regiment joined the British expedition led by General John Forbes to seize Fort Duquesne. Although Forbes valued some of Washington's insights, he rejected Washington's recommended route to the fort. Nevertheless, Forbes awarded Washington the temporary rank of Brevet Brigadier General, placing him in command of one of the 3 brigades designated for the assault. The expedition found Fort Duquesne abandoned by French forces upon arrival, denying Washington an opportunity for combat leadership. Instead, he was involved in a tragic friendly fire incident that resulted in 14 fatalities and 26 injuries. Disillusioned, Washington resigned his commission shortly afterward and returned home to Mount Vernon. During Washington's leadership, the Virginia Regiment successfully defended a 300-mile stretch of frontier, repelling 20 separate attacks from Native American forces within a span of 10 months. Under his command, the regiment expanded significantly, growing from 300 to around 1,000 men and becoming markedly more professional and disciplined. Despite his failure to obtain a royal commission, which fueled lingering resentment toward the British, Washington's service honed his confidence, deepened his leadership abilities, and familiarized him thoroughly with British military strategy. Furthermore, the internal strife he observed among colonial politicians would later inspire his staunch advocacy for a unified and robust central government. On January 6, 1759, at age 26, Washington married Martha Dandridge Custis, the 27-year-old widow of the wealthy plantation owner Daniel Parke Custis. Martha was widely regarded as intelligent, poised, and adept at managing plantation affairs. Their union proved harmonious and supportive. Together, they resided at Mount Vernon, where Washington actively farmed tobacco and wheat. Through his marriage, Washington gained control of Martha's substantial inheritance, her 1/3 dower right in the extensive 18,000-acre Custis estate, and assumed stewardship over the remaining 2/3 for Martha's children. This significantly elevated Washington's financial status, making him one of Virginia's richest and most socially prominent figures. Washington later encouraged Governor Lord Bouttot to honor a 1754 promise by Governor Dinwiddie, granting land bounties to militia volunteers who served during the French and Indian War. In late 1770, Washington personally inspected territories in the Ohio and Great Kanawha regions and employed the surveyor William Crawford to subdivide the lands. Crawford allocated approximately 23,200 acres to Washington. After informing the veterans that their parcels were ill-suited for farming, Washington agreed to buy around 20,147 acres, leaving some veterans feeling deceived by the transaction. Concurrently, he expanded Mount Vernon, eventually doubling its size to around 6,500 acres by 1775, while significantly increasing its enslaved population to over 100 individuals. As an admired military leader and prominent landowner, George Washington naturally assumed various local governmental roles. In 1758, he was elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, representing Frederick County, a position he held for 7 years. Initially, Washington was largely inactive in legislative affairs, seldom attending sessions or speaking publicly. However, his involvement grew significantly throughout the 1760s as he became an outspoken opponent of British taxation and economic policies directed toward the American colonies. Washington maintained a lifestyle that relied heavily on luxury goods imported from England, financing his purchases through tobacco exports. This extravagant spending, coupled with falling tobacco prices, resulted in substantial debts, totaling £1,800 by 1764. His financial stability was further threatened by his dependence on Robert Carey, his primary tobacco merchant in London. To mitigate these economic risks, Washington diversified his agricultural ventures from 1764 to 1766, transitioning Mount Vernon's principal crop from tobacco to wheat and expanding into flour milling and hemp production. The financial strain eased considerably following the unfortunate death of his stepdaughter Patsy from epilepsy in 1773, as her estate's inheritance allowed him to settle his debts. Politically, Washington was increasingly critical of British authority, particularly objecting to taxes imposed by Parliament without colonial representation. He viewed the Stamp Act of 1765 as particularly oppressive and openly celebrated its repeal. In reaction to the Townshend Acts, Washington proposed a boycott of British imports to Virginia's legislature in May 1769. These acts were largely repealed the following year. He also strongly opposed the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which restricted colonial expansion beyond the Allegheny Mountains and interfered with land speculation, a venture in which Washington was deeply involved. When Parliament responded harshly to the Boston Tea Party in 1774 with the Coercive Acts, Washington condemned these laws as a direct assault on colonial liberties. Alongside George Mason, he crafted a set of resolutions for the Fairfax County Committee, including an unprecedented call for ending the Atlantic slave trade, which the committee adopted. Later that year, he attended the First Virginia Convention and was chosen as a delegate to the First Continental Congress. With escalating colonial tensions, Washington actively trained local Virginia militias and helped enforce the Continental Association's boycott of British imports. The American Revolutionary War erupted on April 19, 1775, with clashes at Lexington and Concord. On May 4th, Washington swiftly departed Mount Vernon to join the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Recognizing the urgent need for organized defense, Congress established the Continental Army on June 14th. John Adams nominated Washington as Commander-in-Chief, a decision influenced by Washington's military reputation and the strategic importance of appointing a leader from Virginia to unify the colonies. Congress unanimously confirmed Washington's appointment the following day. In his acceptance speech delivered on June 16th, Washington notably declined a formal salary, though he later accepted reimbursement for personal expenses incurred during his service. Congress appointed senior officers to support Washington, including Artemus Ward, Horatio Gates, Charles Lee, Philip Schuyler, and Nathaniel Greene. Henry Knox, who deeply impressed both Adams and Washington with his expertise in artillery, was promoted to colonel and head of artillery. Likewise, Alexander Hamilton's exceptional intelligence and courage caught Washington's attention. Washington later promoted Hamilton to colonel and appointed him as his trusted aide-de-camp. Initially, Washington prohibited black soldiers, both enslaved and free, from enlisting in the Continental Army. However, the British quickly seized on this exclusion, aiming to exploit colonial divisions. The British colonial governor of Virginia issued a proclamation promising freedom to enslaved individuals who joined British ranks. Confronted with this urgent threat and the desperate need for additional manpower, Washington soon reversed his earlier decision. By the war's conclusion, approximately 10% of Continental Army soldiers were black, some of whom ultimately secured their freedom. In April 1775, amid escalating colonial rebellion, British forces commanded by General Thomas Gage occupied Boston. Local colonial militias swiftly surrounded the city, trapping the British soldiers and initiating a tense stalemate. As Washington journeyed toward Boston in July, enthusiastic crowds welcomed him, solidifying his role as a prominent symbol of the Patriot cause. Upon inspecting the gathered forces, Washington discovered a largely disorganized and poorly disciplined militia. He quickly implemented recommendations from Benjamin Franklin, introducing rigorous military drills and strict disciplinary measures. Recognizing merit, Washington promoted soldiers who had distinguished themselves during the Battle of Bunker Hill, while removing officers he considered incompetent. By October, King George III officially declared the colonies in rebellion, replacing General Gage with General William Howe. When the Charles River froze over, Washington was eager to launch a direct assault on British-held Boston. However, his generals, particularly Gates, warned against risking poorly trained militia in such an attack. Instead, Washington chose a more strategic approach, fortifying Dorchester Heights to pressure British forces. On March 17th, faced with untenable circumstances, approximately 8,900 British troops, accompanied by loyalists and their families, hastily evacuated the city by sea. Washington entered Boston triumphantly with a disciplined force of 500 soldiers, explicitly instructing them to respect local property and avoid looting. He refrained from intervening in civilian governance, delegating these responsibilities to local authorities. Recognizing that the British would retaliate after losing Boston, Washington anticipated an attack on New York City. He arrived there on April 13th, 1776, and immediately ordered defensive preparations, emphasizing respectful treatment of local citizens to prevent abuses similar to those endured in Boston. By July, British forces arrived at Staten Island, assembling an imposing army of 32,000 troops, including professional soldiers and Hessian mercenaries. Washington's army of roughly 23,000 soldiers consisted mostly of inexperienced militia and fresh recruits. In late August, General Howe landed approximately 20,000 British troops at Gravesend, Brooklyn, initiating an advance toward Washington's defensive positions. Operating on flawed intelligence that underestimated Howe's strength at around 8,000 men, Washington opted to engage the British directly. In the subsequent Battle of Long Island, Washington's forces suffered severe casualties, around 1,500 men, under relentless British assault. Outmaneuvered, Washington was forced into a strategic withdrawal to Manhattan, leaving Long Island under British control. General Howe attempted diplomacy by sending a peace overture addressed to George Washington Esquire. Washington refused to accept the communication, insisting on proper diplomatic recognition rather than being treated as a mere rebel leader. Despite his own reservations, Washington heeded General Greene's advice to maintain the defense of Fort Washington, but was ultimately compelled to abandon the position under Howe's aggressive pursuit. As Howe captured Fort Washington in November, loyalists in New York City celebrated him as a liberator and spread false reports accusing Washington of setting fire to the city. Reduced to just 5,400 troops, Washington led his depleted forces in a strategic retreat through New Jersey. In December, Washington made a bold decision to cross the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, bolstering his weakened army by joining forces with General John Sullivan and his 2,000 troops. Facing severe supply shortages, harsh winter conditions, desertions, and looming expirations of enlistments, the future of the Continental Army hung precariously in the balance. Recognizing a vulnerable target, Washington planned a daring surprise attack against a Hessian garrison stationed at Trenton by Howe to maintain control over western New Jersey. At dawn on December 26, 1776, supported by Colonel Knox's artillery, Washington successfully caught the Hessians by surprise, securing a decisive victory. On January 3, 1777, Washington followed this success by returning to New Jersey and launching a sudden strike on British regulars at Princeton. The engagement resulted in roughly 40 American casualties, but significantly heavier British losses, with 273 soldiers either killed or captured. Howe subsequently withdrew his remaining forces to New York City for winter quarters, while Washington established his winter headquarters in Morristown, New Jersey. These twin victories at Trenton and Princeton proved strategically crucial, revitalizing Patriot spirits and undermining the British approach of intimidating the colonies through force before offering conciliatory peace terms. The war's momentum had significantly shifted. In July 1777, British General John Burgoyne advanced south from Quebec, retaking Fort Ticonderoga as part of a broader strategy aimed at isolating New England during the Saratoga campaign. Contrary to expectations, General Howe diverted his army from New York City, heading instead to Philadelphia rather than joining Burgoyne at Albany. Washington, accompanied by the young French officer Gilbert, Marquis de Lafayette, swiftly marched to intercept Howe. On September 11th, during the Battle of Brandywine, Howe tactically outflanked Washington's army, allowing British forces to occupy Philadelphia without resistance. An attempt by Washington to reclaim initiative at the Battle of Germantown in October ultimately ended in failure, leaving Philadelphia under British control. In upstate New York, Patriot forces were commanded by General Horatio Gates. Concerned by Burgoyne's continued march southward, Washington dispatched reinforcements northward under Generals Benedict Arnold and Benjamin Lincoln. On October 7, 1777, Burgoyne attempted to seize control of Bemis Heights, but found himself cut off from essential support and supplies, ultimately forcing his surrender. Gates' victory elevated his standing among Washington's critics, prompting some to openly prefer Gates as the Army's primary leader. Historian John Alden noted that such contrasting outcomes, Gates' triumphs in the North and Washington's defeats elsewhere, inevitably invited unfavorable comparisons. As a result, Washington's reputation began to suffer significantly. In December 1777, Washington and approximately 11,000 Continental soldiers established winter quarters at Valley Forge, north of Philadelphia. The harsh conditions proved devastating. Disease, starvation, and inadequate clothing claimed the lives of 2,000 to 3,000 men, reducing Washington's effective strength below 9,000 by February. Morale deteriorated rapidly, exacerbating desertions and prompting some officers to secretly lobby members of Congress for Washington's removal. However, loyal supporters defended Washington vigorously, and these efforts to remove him from command eventually subsided. Washington urgently petitioned Congress for better supplies and repeatedly emphasized the Army's dire circumstances. Congress responded by reorganizing the Army's supply system, specifically strengthening the quartermaster and commissary departments. In tandem, Washington launched the Grand Forage of 1778, a campaign to secure provisions from surrounding areas. Crucially, Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben's disciplined training regimen transformed the once raw recruits into a cohesive professional army. Recognizing von Steuben's effectiveness, Washington appointed him Inspector General. In early 1778, the American cause received a significant boost when France formally allied itself with the colonies. That May, General Howe resigned, and Sir Henry Clinton assumed command. Clinton evacuated Philadelphia, retreating toward New York in June. Washington convened a council of American and French commanders and decided on a limited attack against Clinton's forces during their withdrawal. However, Generals Charles Lee and Marquis de Lafayette prematurely engaged the enemy without Washington's direct knowledge, initially mishandling their strike on June 28th at the Battle of Monmouth. Washington promptly relieved Lee and personally reorganized his troops, stabilizing the battle into an eventual stalemate. Clinton continued his retreat, safely reaching New York. This encounter effectively ended major northern and middle state campaigns. Washington would not engage the British Army in another major battle for over 3 years. The British shifted their strategic focus southward, capturing Savannah, Georgia, in late 1778. In response, Washington ordered a campaign targeting the Iroquois, allies of the British, destroying several of their villages. Throughout this period, Washington also became America's pioneering spy master, setting up an extensive espionage network to monitor British activities. In 1778, Major Benjamin Tallmadge, under Washington's guidance, organized the Culper Ring, a secret intelligence group operating in New York City. The Culper Ring's intelligence notably prevented a British surprise attack on French forces, an operation conceived based on intelligence supplied by the notorious American general turned British spy, Benedict Arnold. Washington initially overlooked signs of Benedict Arnold's disloyalty, largely due to Arnold's distinguished service in earlier campaigns, such as the invasion of Quebec. However, in 1779, Arnold secretly began providing the British spy master John Andre with crucial intelligence meant to facilitate the capture of West Point, a vital defensive stronghold on the Hudson River. On September 21, 1780, Arnold handed Andre detailed plans for taking the fort. Shortly thereafter, Andre was captured by Patriot militia, who discovered the incriminating documents. Arnold managed to escape to New York. Upon learning of Arnold's betrayal, Washington quickly secured West Point by recalling subordinate commanders, personally assuming control, and reinforcing its defenses. By June 1780, the British had seized control of the South Carolina Piedmont and consolidated their dominance across the southern colonies. Washington's spirits were notably lifted when Marquis de Lafayette returned from France, bringing additional ships, soldiers, and vital supplies. Furthermore, 5,000 seasoned French troops led by Marshal Rochambeau arrived in Newport, Rhode Island, significantly bolstering American resources. In December, General Clinton dispatched Arnold, now a British brigadier general, to Virginia with 1,700 troops to capture Portsmouth and conduct raids against Patriot positions. Washington countered by sending Lafayette southward to confront Arnold. Originally, Washington had intended to engage the British directly in New York to force them away from Virginia, but Rochambeau persuaded him that Cornwallis's vulnerable position at Yorktown presented a more advantageous target. Thus, on August 19, 1781, Washington and Rochambeau set off toward Yorktown in what would later be celebrated as a pivotal strategic march. Washington took charge of an impressive coalition force composed of 7,800 French soldiers, 8,000 Continental troops, and around 3,100 militiamen. Although less experienced in siege tactics, Washington often consulted Rochambeau for guidance. Despite their close collaboration, Rochambeau consistently respected Washington's ultimate authority as the commander-in-chief. By late September, American and French forces had successfully encircled Yorktown, trapping Cornwallis's army. Meanwhile, the French naval victory at the Battle of the Chesapeake cut off British reinforcements and escape routes by sea. Washington himself initiated the final offensive. The siege culminated in Cornwallis's surrender on October 19, 1781, resulting in the capture of over 7,000 British soldiers. Washington meticulously negotiated surrender terms, with the formal ceremony held on October 19th. Although official peace negotiations continued until 1783, Yorktown effectively marked the Revolutionary War's decisive and concluding battle. The British Parliament formally agreed to end hostilities in March 1782. As peace talks commenced in April 1782, British and French forces gradually withdrew from American territory. In March 1783, Washington notably diffused the Newburgh Conspiracy, a potentially dangerous mutiny among officers frustrated by unpaid wages. At war's end, Washington submitted a detailed expense report totaling $450,000, reflecting personal funds he had advanced to support army operations. Congress ultimately approved the reimbursement, although some sums were vaguely detailed and included expenses related to Martha Washington's visits to military encampments. On September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was officially signed, with Britain formally recognizing American independence. In the aftermath, George Washington took steps to disband his army, delivering an emotional farewell speech to his troops on November 2nd. He then supervised the orderly evacuation of British soldiers from New York City, entering the liberated city to enthusiastic parades and celebrations. In early December of the same year, Washington gathered his officers at Fraunces Tavern in New York for a final farewell before formally resigning his commission as Commander-in-Chief. During his last official appearance before Congress, Washington, dressed once more in uniform, solemnly entrusted the nation's future to divine protection, declaring, "I consider it an indispensable duty to close this last solemn act of my official life by commending the interests of our dearest country to the protection of Almighty God and those who have the superintendence of them to His holy keeping." This graceful resignation was widely praised both in America and internationally. Historian Edward J. Larson later described it as a pivotal moment that profoundly influenced the nation's political trajectory. In recognition of his service, Washington was subsequently appointed President General of the Society of the Cincinnati, an organization founded to honor the officers of the Revolutionary War. Having spent barely 10 days at Mount Vernon during more than 8 years of warfare, Washington eagerly anticipated returning home. Arriving on Christmas Eve 1783, he deeply relished the tranquility and solitude of civilian life. Historian John E. Furling noted Washington's profound relief at leaving behind military camps and public obligations. Yet, despite his retreat from official duties, Mount Vernon soon became a destination for many visitors eager to honor the revered leader in person. Following the Revolutionary War, Washington renewed his involvement with pre-war ventures such as the Great Dismal Swamp and Potomac Canal projects. Despite his dedication, neither endeavor provided financial returns. In 1784, he embarked on a lengthy journey lasting 34 days, covering 680 miles through the Ohio country to personally oversee his land investments. Back at Mount Vernon, Washington supervised extensive remodeling, transforming the estate into the impressive mansion that remains today. However, his finances during this period were precarious. Payments from creditors came in the form of depreciated wartime currency, and he faced substantial debts, taxes, and unpaid wages. Mount Vernon itself had failed to turn a profit during his wartime absence, experiencing several years of disappointing harvests due to pests and unfavorable weather. By 1787, his estate had run at a deficit for 11 consecutive years. Determined to restore profitability, Washington pursued innovative agricultural strategies. He initiated a new landscaping design featuring diverse, fast-growing trees and native plants. He also introduced mule breeding at Mount Vernon after receiving a prized mule stud from King Charles III of Spain in 1785, believing these sturdy animals could significantly enhance agricultural productivity. Washington maintained a keen interest in national affairs even as he attempted retirement. Prior to fully returning to private life in June 1783, he emphasized the urgent need for stronger national unity. Concerned that the Articles of Confederation were ineffectual, a rope of sand, as he described them, Washington sent a circular letter urging the states toward establishing a more robust central government. He feared that without it, the nation risked slipping into chaos, vulnerability, and foreign manipulation. The urgency of his warnings became evident during Shays's rebellion in Massachusetts in 1786, an uprising that convinced Washington of the pressing necessity for constitutional reform. Nationalist leaders, worried about rising disorder, convened in Annapolis that September and petitioned Congress to amend the Articles of Confederation. Congress responded by authorizing a constitutional convention to convene in Philadelphia the following year, urging states to send delegates. Initially hesitant about the convention's legality, Washington was selected to lead Virginia's delegation, but initially declined. After consulting with close advisors such as James Madison and Henry Knox, he reconsidered. His colleagues argued persuasively that Washington's respected presence would inspire broader participation, ease the path to ratification, and lend essential legitimacy to the convention's ambitious work. Ultimately convinced, he agreed to participate, significantly influencing the convention's success. Washington arrived in Philadelphia on May 9, 1787, and the Constitutional Convention convened on May 25. Benjamin Franklin nominated Washington to preside over the proceedings, and he was unanimously selected. Early debates focused on the ambitious Virginia Plan, proposed by Edmund Randolph and drafted primarily by James Madison, which Washington strongly supported. This plan advocated for an entirely new constitution and a powerful national government. However, disagreements quickly emerged over issues of representation, prompting the introduction of an alternative, known as the New Jersey Plan. Frustrated by the intense debates, Washington confided in Alexander Hamilton on July 10th, expressing doubts about a successful outcome and regretting his involvement. Nevertheless, his influential presence and personal persuasion encouraged delegates toward compromise. Ultimately, the convention adopted the Connecticut Compromise, blending elements of both proposals. The Constitution was signed on September 17, 1787, by 39 of the 55 attending delegates. Leading up to America's first presidential election in 1789, Washington was appointed Chancellor of the College of William and Mary, a role he maintained throughout his presidency until his death. Delegates expected Washington to become the nation's first president, leaving him considerable flexibility in defining the office. When electors cast their ballots on February 4, 1789, Washington achieved a unanimous election, the only US president to ever receive such unified support. John Adams secured the vice presidency. Despite deep personal reservations about leaving his peaceful life at Mount Vernon, Washington departed for New York City on April 16, 1789, to assume his new responsibilities. George Washington was inaugurated on April 30, 1789, at Federal Hall in New York City. Accompanied by militia, a marching band, dignitaries, and crowds numbering around 10,000, he rode in a ceremonial coach through enthusiastic celebrations. Robert R. Livingston administered the oath of office, with Washington placing his hand on a Bible provided by the Masons. In his inaugural address delivered in the Senate chamber, he called upon that Almighty Being to safeguard the liberties and happiness of the American people. Although Washington originally wished to decline any payment, Congress insisted he accept an annual salary of $25,000, far exceeding the Vice President's $5,000. Aware of the importance of his actions as precedents for future leaders, Washington emphasized to James Madison that each decision he made should rest upon solid principles. Rejecting grandiose titles suggested by the Senate, such as His Majesty or His Highness the President, Washington insisted on the simpler and more democratic title of Mr. President. During his presidency, he established many foundational traditions, including delivering an inaugural address, regularly sending messages to Congress, forming an executive cabinet, and selecting the initial members of the Supreme Court. George Washington proved himself a capable administrator, skilled at assessing both talent and character. Unlike the previous Confederation government, which suffered from weak leadership, crippling debt, worthless currency, and no executive power or effective taxation system, Washington's administration was built on a stronger constitutional foundation. In 1789, Congress established executive departments, the Departments of State, War, and Treasury, and Washington appointed Edmund Randolph as Attorney General, Samuel Osgood as Postmaster General, Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Henry Knox as Secretary of War, and Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. These selections formed Washington's cabinet, an advisory group not specifically mandated by the Constitution, but instrumental in guiding policy. He controlled cabinet discussions carefully, restricting debates to topics of his choosing, and expected department heads to implement his decisions without dissent. Despite holding veto power, Washington exercised it sparingly, even signing some bills that conflicted with his personal judgment. Throughout his presidency, Washington staunchly opposed political factions and remained the only US president to genuinely maintain a nonpartisan stance. Nevertheless, ideological divisions emerged among his closest advisors, laying the groundwork for America's first party system. Alexander Hamilton formed the Federalist Party, advocating strong national credit and a powerful federal financial system, while Thomas Jefferson opposed Hamilton's vision, founding what became known as the Jeffersonian Republicans. Although officially neutral, Washington tended to favor Hamilton's policies, resulting in considerable political controversy. Other critical domestic issues during his first term included planning for a permanent national capital, adopting constitutional amendments such as the Bill of Rights, and grappling with debates over slavery and westward expansion into indigenous territories. In a symbolic act of unity, Washington designated November 26, 1789, as a national day of thanksgiving. Initially reluctant to seek a second presidential term, Washington was exhausted by the responsibilities of office, declining health, and intense internal political conflict. His wife, Martha, strongly encouraged him not to continue. Compounding his reluctance, Washington's nephew, George Augustine Washington, who managed Mount Vernon during his absence, fell critically ill. Nevertheless, prominent leaders, including Madison, Jefferson, and Hamilton, strongly urged him to reconsider. Madison warned of worsening partisan divisions if Washington stepped aside, while Jefferson promised to end his conflicts with Hamilton. Hamilton himself argued that Washington's departure would profoundly harm the nation. Convinced by these appeals, Washington agreed to run again, and on February 13, 1793, the Electoral College unanimously re-elected him president, with John Adams returned as vice president by a narrower margin. Washington took the presidential oath for his second term on March 4, 1793, in Philadelphia's Congress Hall, administered by Associate Justice William Cushing. Following the outbreak of the French Revolutionary Wars, Washington issued a neutrality proclamation on April 22, 1793, clearly stating the United States' intention to remain impartial toward the warring European powers. Despite formally recognizing France's revolutionary government, Washington later requested the recall of French envoy Edmond Charles Genet, whose actions openly defied American neutrality. Genet had commissioned American vessels as privateers against British allies and attempted to mobilize militias for further attacks, hoping to draw the US into the broader European conflict. Washington's firm stance prevented Genet's efforts from escalating into war. Two significant domestic crises defined Washington's second term. The first was the Whiskey Rebellion, 1791 to 1794, a violent uprising in Pennsylvania over federal liquor taxation. Demonstrating decisive leadership, Washington personally led militia forces into Pennsylvania, quickly suppressing the revolt and asserting the federal government's authority. The second crisis was the Northwest Indian War, a conflict between American settlers and Native American tribes supported by British troops still occupying forts in the region. In 1794, American forces decisively defeated indigenous warriors at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, effectively ending the conflict and stabilizing the northwestern frontier. Alexander Hamilton was instrumental in shaping the Jay Treaty, aiming to stabilize trade relations with Britain, secure their withdrawal from Western forts, and settle lingering financial debts from the Revolutionary War. Representing Washington's administration, Chief Justice John Jay signed the treaty on November 19, 1794. Although Washington supported the treaty primarily because it helped avoid another conflict, he was privately disappointed by terms that appeared overly favorable to Britain. Despite significant public backlash and political controversy, Washington mobilized support to ensure the treaty's ratification. Under the treaty, Britain vacated its forts near the Great Lakes, outstanding pre-war debts were settled, and American merchants gained limited access to trade with the British West Indies. These outcomes brought a decade of prosperous trade and peace with Britain, but Thomas Jefferson sharply criticized the agreement, claiming it unnecessarily provoked France. Jefferson's concerns proved accurate when French-American relations worsened dramatically following the treaty's signing. Just 2 days before Washington left office, the French Directory authorized the seizure of American ships, leaving his successor, John Adams, facing the looming possibility of war. Diplomatic relations with Spain, however, proved more fruitful. Thomas Pinckney successfully negotiated the Treaty of San Lorenzo in 1795, clearly defining the southern U.S. border and granting Americans important navigational rights on the Mississippi River. In Washington's cabinet, internal disagreements led to significant departures. Thomas Jefferson resigned from his position as Secretary of State in July 1793. and Alexander Hamilton stepped down as Treasury Secretary in January 1795, replaced by Oliver Wolcott Jr., Washington's relationship with Secretary of War Henry Knox soured due to allegations that Knox had personally profited from contracts to construct naval frigates authorized by the Naval Act of 1794, purportedly for defending against Barbary pirates. Under pressure from these accusations, Knox ultimately resigned. During his presidency's final months, Washington endured intense political criticism and attacks from an increasingly partisan press, who accused him of excessive ambition and greed. He increasingly viewed the press as a divisive force undermining national unity. Additionally, Washington firmly resisted congressional demands for access to internal documents related to the Jay Treaty, arguing that such disclosures were inappropriate except in cases of impeachment proceedings. As his second term ended, Washington decided firmly to retire, discouraged by ongoing personal attacks and determined to enable a genuinely contested presidential election. Although he did not feel personally constrained to a two-term limit, his decision set a crucial precedent for future presidents. Anticipating his departure, Washington had originally tasked James Madison in May 1792 with preparing a draft of a farewell address. This draft was substantially revised by Alexander Hamilton in 1796, with Washington himself providing final edits. The completed address was published by David Claypool's American Daily Advertiser on September 19, 1796. In his farewell address, Washington strongly emphasized the importance of national unity, declaring that the collective identity as American must inspire a deep sense of patriotic pride. He cautioned the nation against divisive political factions and warned against entangling alliances with foreign powers that could draw America into unnecessary conflicts. While advocating commerce and friendship with all nations, Washington counseled strongly against involvement in European disputes. Additionally, he highlighted religion and morality as essential foundations for maintaining a stable and virtuous republic. In the closing words of his farewell address, Washington humbly reflected upon his legacy. "I fervently beseech the Almighty to avert or mitigate the evils to which my unintended errors may tend. I shall also carry with me the hope that my country will never cease to view them with indulgence, and that after 45 years of my life dedicated to its service with an upright zeal, the faults of incompetent abilities will be consigned to oblivion, as myself must soon be to the mansions of rest." Despite its initially reverential reception, the farewell address quickly faced criticism from Republicans, including James Madison, who saw it as overtly pro-British and anti-French political propaganda. Nevertheless, historical opinion later elevated the address considerably. Scholar James Flexner in 1972 likened its significance to Jefferson's Declaration of Independence and Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, while historian Ron Chernow in 2010 described it as a profound and enduring statement of Republican values. After concluding his presidency in March 1797, Washington returned to his beloved Mount Vernon, dedicating himself primarily to business and agricultural pursuits. Although he actively managed his plantation, profits remained elusive, and his investments in western lands, particularly in the Piedmont region, brought little return despite repeated attempts at sale. Politically, Washington grew increasingly committed to Federalist ideals, publicly endorsing controversial policies like the Alien and Sedition Acts, and urging prominent Federalist John Marshall to challenge Jeffersonian dominance in Virginia politics. When French privateers began capturing American ships in 1798, triggering the Quasi-War, Washington offered his assistance to President John Adams in reorganizing the nation's military. In recognition, Adams appointed him Lieutenant General and Commander-in-Chief of American forces on July 4, 1798. From July 13th of that year until his death 17 months later, Washington served primarily in an advisory capacity, participating in strategic planning, but entrusting day-to-day command to Alexander Hamilton. Although tensions remained high, the conflict did not escalate to a full-scale invasion, and Washington did not assume active field command during this final chapter of public service. George Washington projected an appearance of considerable wealth and sophistication, a portrayal historian Ron Chernow described as a glorified facade of wealth and grandeur at Mount Vernon. Yet, much of Washington's perceived wealth was not liquid, but tied up in extensive land holdings and the ownership of enslaved people. To increase his available income, Washington established a whiskey distillery at Mount Vernon. He also strategically purchased parcels of land near the emerging federal city, named in his honor in 1791, selling these individual plots to middle-class buyers rather than larger investors, as he believed smaller buyers were more likely to develop the land actively. At his death in 1799, Washington's estate was valued at roughly $780,000, encompassing over 58,000 acres spanning Virginia, Ohio, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, Kentucky, and the Northwest Territory. Adjusted for inflation, his peak net worth would have equated to approximately $587 million in today's currency. On December 12, 1799, Washington spent several hours inspecting his farms on horseback despite harsh weather, afterward dining with guests without changing from his wet clothes. The following day, he experienced throat soreness, but remained active, marking trees for cutting. By early morning December 14th, his condition had worsened significantly, prompting him to request that his estate manager, George Rawlins, remove nearly a pint of blood, a common medical practice at the time. His condition deteriorated further, prompting family members to call in physicians James Craik, Gustavus Richard Brown, and Elisha C. Dick. Initially, Brown believed Washington had quinsy, while Dick suspected a severe inflammation of the throat membranes. The doctors collectively withdrew approximately 5 pints of blood, exacerbating Washington's condition. Dick suggested performing a tracheotomy, but his colleagues, unfamiliar with the procedure, declined. Acknowledging his imminent death, Washington reassured Dr. Craik, "Doctor, I die hard, but I am not afraid to go." Fearful of premature burial, Washington instructed his private secretary, Tobias Lear, to delay burial for 3 days following his death. According to Lear, Washington passed away between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. on December 14th, 1799, with his wife Martha at his bedside. His final words were reportedly, "'Tis well." Washington's precise cause of death has been debated extensively. Contemporary doctors described it as synancha trachealis, a severe throat inflammation condition. Modern medical analysis generally agrees that Washington likely succumbed to severe epiglottitis compounded by the aggressive treatments, including repeated bloodletting and calomel administration, ultimately leading to hypovolemic shock. Washington's funeral took place on December 18, 1799, at Mount Vernon, 4 days after his passing. The solemn procession featured cavalry and infantry soldiers, with 6 colonels serving as pallbearers. The ceremony itself was largely attended by family members and close friends. Reverend Thomas Davis officiated the brief religious service, which was followed by rites conducted by members of Washington's Masonic Lodge, a fraternity he had joined in 1752. News of Washington's death spread slowly, prompting church bells to toll and businesses to close across the nation as word reached various communities. Public memorials and processions were organized in numerous cities. Martha Washington, determined to preserve the privacy of their relationship, burned nearly all their correspondence, with only 5 letters known to have survived. Washington was initially buried in the family vault at Mount Vernon on December 18, 1799. In his will, he directed the construction of a new, more secure burial site, which was eventually completed in 1831 after an attempt by a disgruntled former estate employee to steal what he mistakenly believed was Washington's skull. In 1832, Congress debated relocating Washington's remains to a special crypt beneath the U.S. Capitol. However, strong objections arose from Southern representatives who feared that deepening sectional divisions could eventually separate Washington's resting place from his native Virginia. Representative Wiley Thompson articulated these anxieties, expressing concern about Washington's body potentially resting on a shore foreign to his native soil if national unity failed. Consequently, Washington's remains stayed at Mount Vernon. On October 7, 1837, they were carefully transferred into a marble sarcophagus designed by architect William Strickland and crafted by John Struthers. Washington was baptized into the Anglican Church shortly after his birth in April 1732 and maintained a lifelong commitment to his faith. He served diligently as a vestryman and church warden for over 20 years in Virginia's Fairfax and Truro parishes. Although Washington privately engaged in daily Bible reading and prayer and publicly encouraged religious observance, records indicate he ceased regularly receiving communion after the Revolutionary War. Reflecting the Enlightenment era's influence, Washington often described his faith using terms such as providence, the Almighty, and the divine author, believing that divine forces actively shaped his life, guided battle outcomes, and influenced the founding of the United States. Historian Ron Chernow notes, Washington carefully avoided overt displays of personal piety or evangelistic zeal, refraining from using religion as a political tool. Nevertheless, Washington frequently quoted scripture and referenced the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. As president, Washington publicly supported religious tolerance and opposed any official state religion. Although personally shaped by Enlightenment values, he respected organized Christianity and its clergy, expressing gratitude for the triumph of reason and tolerance over bigotry and superstition in American life. Washington was also a prominent Freemason, joining the Masonic Lodge established in Fredericksburg, Virginia, in 1752. Initiated at the age of 20, he quickly rose through the ranks to become a Master Mason. Although recommended for the esteemed position of Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Virginia in 1777, Washington either declined or was never formally offered the role. Later, he served as the Charter Master of Alexandria Lodge No. 22 from 1788 to 1789. On a personal level, Washington's 1751 battle with smallpox may have left him sterile, though historian Chernow also suggests Martha may have sustained childbirth injuries, preventing additional pregnancies. The couple regretted having no biological children together, though they raised Martha's children, John Park Custis, Jackie, and Martha Park Custis, Patsy, and later cared for Jackie's two youngest children, Eleanor Park Custis, Nellie, and George Washington Park Custis, Washi. They also supported numerous nieces and nephews. A claim persists among some descendants of West Ford, an enslaved man owned by Washington's younger brother, John Augustine Washington, that Ford was fathered by George Washington. However, this claim remains a subject of historical debate. George Washington was known for a reserved yet commanding personality. While he willingly gave speeches and public statements when necessary, he wasn't recognized as a particularly eloquent or dynamic speaker. Moderation defined much of Washington's personal conduct. He consumed alcohol sparingly and morally opposed excessive drinking, tobacco smoking, gambling, and profanity. Physically imposing, Washington stood taller than most men of his time, with historical accounts placing his height between 6 feet and 6 feet 3.5 inches. He possessed notable physical strength, grey-blue eyes, and distinctive reddish-brown hair, which he wore powdered, curled, and tied back in a fashionable queue, rather than using the powdered wigs common among his contemporaries. Washington struggled throughout his life with severe dental issues, ultimately losing all but one of his teeth. During his presidency, he relied on several sets of false teeth made from materials like ivory, metal, bone, animal teeth, and even human teeth, some of which might have come from enslaved individuals. Contrary to popular belief, none of these dentures were wooden. His chronic dental problems caused persistent pain, for which he regularly took laudanum, an opioid solution used at the time for pain relief. Additionally, early in his presidency, Washington suffered from a painful growth on his thigh and endured a nearly fatal bout of pneumonia in 1790, from which he never entirely recovered. A skilled horseman, Washington was highly regarded for his equestrian abilities. Thomas Jefferson praised him as the best horseman of his age. Washington maintained a stable of thoroughbred horses at Mount Vernon, his favorites among them being Blueskin and Nelson. Legacy: George Washington remains one of the most influential and iconic figures in American history. His importance was famously captured by Virginia Governor Henry Lee, who memorialized him as first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Modern assessments consistently rank Washington among the greatest American presidents. Internationally, Washington became an emblem of national independence and revolutionary success, having led the world's first successful colonial revolt against a major empire. Congress honored him in 1879 by establishing Washington's birthday as a federal holiday. Further recognition came in 1976 when, as part of the American bicentennial celebrations, Washington was posthumously promoted to the rank of General of the Armies, with President Gerald Ford declaring that Washington would henceforth outrank every other officer in American history. Early biographer Mason Locke Weems significantly shaped public perception of Washington through his widely circulated and idealized 1809 biography. Historian Ron Chernow notes that Weems sought to portray Washington as both relatable and exemplary, creating enduring stories, including the well-known but historically uncertain anecdote of young Washington's honesty about chopping down a cherry tree. although such accounts lack definitive proof, they continue to contribute to Washington's legendary status in American culture. In the 21st century, George Washington's legacy has faced increased critical examination. Historian John Ferling notes that Washington remains uniquely revered, being the only founding father and US president commonly described as godlike, yet also the most thoroughly analyzed by historians. David Hackett Fisher defined Washington's character as a blend of integrity, courage, self-discipline, unwavering honesty, determination, and decisiveness, tempered by his decency, patience, and respectfulness towards others. Historian Ron Chernow argues that Washington generally sought a balanced approach toward relations with indigenous peoples, encouraging them to transition from nomadic hunting lifestyles to settled agricultural communities similar to those of white settlers. According to Chernow, Washington did not actively promote outright confiscation or forced displacement of native tribes. In contrast, historian Colin G. Calloway asserts that Washington had a persistent desire to acquire Native American lands, either for himself or the nation, which led to policies and military campaigns with devastating impacts. Calloway explains that while Washington preferred a peaceful relinquishment of lands at a fair compensation, he readily justified military force and destruction of indigenous settlements if they resisted, believing such actions justified by necessity. Washington has also faced scrutiny for his involvement in slavery. Although he publicly expressed a desire for the legislative abolition of slavery, he neither actively advocated nor pursued practical measures to achieve it. This contradiction has prompted contemporary debates about removing Washington's name from public institutions and monuments from public spaces. Washington's presidential library is located at Mount Vernon, designated a National Historic Landmark, and the Library of Congress houses his extensive collection of personal papers and correspondence. Namesakes and monuments. Numerous monuments and landmarks across the United States bear Washington's name, reflecting his enduring legacy. Among these are the nation's capital city, Washington, D.C., and the state of Washington. The Washington Monument, a 555-foot marble obelisk, was formally dedicated on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. on February 21, 1885. Washington's likeness also features prominently on Mount Rushmore in South Dakota, as one of 4 U.S. presidents immortalized in stone by sculptor Gutzon Borglum. Additionally, the George Washington Bridge, opened in 1931, connects New York City and New Jersey. Several educational institutions carry his name, including George Washington University and Washington University. He continues to appear prominently on contemporary U.S. currency, including the $1 bill, the presidential $1 coin, and the $quarter coin, the Washington Quarter. His portrait first appeared on America's inaugural postage stamp in 1847, and since then, he has appeared on more U.S. postage stamps than any other individual. George Washington remains a complex figure, simultaneously revered and reassessed as each generation grapples with his legacy. His story is woven deeply into the American identity, embodying leadership, perseverance, and the enduring struggle between idealism and human imperfection. Whether celebrated as a foundational hero or scrutinized for his contradictions and moral ambiguities, Washington's life continues to invite examination and debate. Ultimately, his lasting influence is reflected not only in the countless monuments and institutions that bear his name, but in the very principles and tensions that define the nation he helped forge.